Chris, I'm going to get you to speak first because you haven't had the opportunity yet.
That's right.
And there was a particular question here, and I'll just read this out. How is Microsoft looking to roll out projects from OpenAI, such as ChatGPT, across other products beyond Bing? But what would be interesting is maybe just give us a bit of perspective on Microsoft overall in terms of where you sit in the open source space. And
no matter where I'm going at the moment, I always get the ChatGPT OpenAI, so that's not a huge surprise. But yeah, let me quickly start really quick spiel on open source, because to be honest, that's not always top of mind for most with Microsoft, right? But the reality is, as developers, we've been using open source with Microsoft for some time, right? Whether that's .NET, C#, our investments in that space, and then fast forward over the last couple of years, VS Code, and a lot of what we're doing in the open source community, especially in the microservices space with Dapper and some of the next-gen technologies. It's not just me saying that. If you look at most of the CNCF projects, increasingly we're donating a lot of our new R&D straight to CNCF. And I think a huge part of that, and this really goes to our open source strategy, is meeting customers where they are and the ecosystem, right? We recognize that no matter where customers are running, the ecosystem outflanks our own R&D and our own IP. So that's the way we think about it. To dovetail into OpenAI, very, very topical and top of mind for most. So not going to repeat of what's going on in the industry. I'll quickly summarize it as saying, OpenAI is its own standalone entity. We, Microsoft, have a joint venture or an R&D relationship, which we actually package and position that as Azure's OpenAI. So that's one of the first call-outs. Azure OpenAI runs in Microsoft's Azure environment. The underlying models are identical, but that said, as it relates to Bing as an example, for those of you that have been playing with the inline Bing experience, that is not just OpenAI, that's OpenAI with Microsoft large learning models, LLMs and LLGs, and then our own IP from Bing over the years and our own trained models. So that's, in a nutshell, the fundamental difference. What I'll quickly say, and it goes to the question, a lot of people are asking us, what are we doing with it? Anything and everything, right? So from Microsoft's core products, Office 365, Teams, Dynamics, most of what you can do with adaptive AI, so inline AI to improve experience, it's pretty much top of mind in most of our products, right? And we're already starting to see announcements pretty much month on month, week on week. But it's not just Microsoft's internal R&D, it's also empowering our customers. So we're seeing an unexpected proliferation of adoption, right? And that's pretty much all the industries that you had on the screen, Linus. It's everything, right? And it's really hard for me to pinpoint them because it is almost everything. Now, as always with AI, we need to tread carefully. So we take that statement very, very, very seriously. So for those of you that are trialing or want to play with Azure OpenAI as an example, we actually have a really stringent onboarding process, right? And I can spend hours talking about our ethics and how we control what people are doing with our models, but the reality is we want to vet what people are doing to make sure it's being used for good, but also we have the right guardrails. So we recognize that in this space, innovation by far is outgrowing global legislation. So we take that mission statement very, very, very seriously, and we are proactively working with global regulators to actually govern ourselves, because if we know that if we don't do that and the technology overtakes, then the technology will be shut down for most. So that's a quick summary. I don't want this event to turn into an OpenAI GPT chat, so out of respect for the sponsors, grab me for the time that we have for lunch, but hopefully that answers the question.
No, it's great, Chris. Great to hear perspective, and obviously Microsoft's a wonderful partner with us as well, so it's great to hear. So we've got a couple of other questions, which I suppose are broader questions around open source. I'm just going to ask the question. You guys figure out who wants to sort of answer that first. So one of the questions was around, I suppose, the commercial settings. So the question is, how are the considerations of using open source in commercial settings changing as open source project contributors are increasingly coming from companies rather than individual contributors. Does anyone have a perspective on that?
I think I can take that.
Okay.
So that's I think this is a very good question, and this is a very fair observation. I've been in the open source space for a while, before SUSE in another company as well, and back then open source was just picking up, and what you see is that when you look at the open source contributors, these are generally people. A lot of them are people who are doing it as a pastime, right? And building software. Today things have changed. Today, if you look at most of the projects, and if you go to GitHub, the majority of the contributors will be from the parent company. Is that good or is that bad? I would say that the ethos of open source is to leverage the power of communities and get people from all over the world come together to innovate. So getting the best minds. If you can get the best minds to come together, it doesn't matter whether they're coming from companies or whether they are hobbyists. Where things get tricky is when you have companies' agenda seeping in. And I've seen that in other companies that I've worked. So I would say that there are two considerations. One is open source. Open source is a way of building software, it's a methodology. But that is not the only thing that is necessary to promote real innovation. There's the other piece to it, which is called openness. Openness is more of a culture. Openness is something that a company needs to do intentionally. And what do I mean by openness? What it means is, if I'm building an open source project, I want to make sure that the final project is going to be interoperable across any types of technology or as many technologies, instead of saying that it will only work on these few platforms, which are basically platforms that my company produces, the other platforms. That is vendor lock-in. Today there's a term called FOSS, and that's been around, free open source software, and then people got confused because the free doesn't mean free as in no cost. So now they have something called FLOSS, right? Free/libre open source software. I have a new term that I came up many years back. It is proprietary open source software. Proprietary open source software means you use the open source principles, but at the end of the day, your software is proprietary because, well, it will only work with my stack or limited other vendors. So I think that is a consideration when evaluating a company. Everyone does things in the open source way today. Look at the underlying principles, the ethos. Check the support metrics. Is it going to be supported? For example, operating system, for example, is one of the fundamental things for software. If it's only going to be supporting a specific set of open source, I would say, operating systems, then that's a red flag. So I think that's some of my perspectives. Not sure if you guys have other things to add.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just want to add to that, Vishal, you touched on a lot of good points. As an employee of a company as well, personally, the first place I go to is my employment contract, right? I take a look at it. And then I take a look at the New South Wales state laws, in terms of the work laws as well, right? If I write code, who does it belong to? And what if I write code that's nothing to do with what my company does, and it's in my own spare time, I decided to write code that deals with another pet project area of mine. Let's say it's just, making coffee or something, right? Who does it belong to as well? We've got to get around this for sure, to make sure we know where we stand. Most organizations now have developed cadence around, a contractual capability where, they inform developers, fine, you want to do so in a structured manner, put it onto a repository, and we'll be able to publish it, and only maybe certain developer classes could do so, right, under the company banner as well. Everything else, you're free on your own. This notion of time as well doesn't really exist anymore because of hybrid work, right? We're working anywhere, everywhere, odd hours, so you can't say, I did it on a Saturday, so it's mine, right? So again, be clear on that one for sure. It is in the company's interest, of course, to open source IP, right, where it benefits the organization as well. So they're trying to drive standards. when I said standardization, that's super important, right? One of the reasons why an electric EV manufacturer want to open source some of its designs is because they know as an industry they get better economies of scale, right, when it comes to the electrification platform. But that's not where their competitive advantage would be derived from. The competitive advantage would be perhaps in another area, right, like in autonomous driving capabilities. So they know that there's economies of scale, right, to be driven if they release, right, some of their designs to the open source community. So again, thinking about that way can help.
Yeah, I think I wasn't expecting floss, Vishal, but thank you for that. Hey, I just want to transition a little bit. We've talked about security. There were a couple of questions on security. Just want to pose those to you, gentlemen, and then probably just get some questions from the audience as well. So one that came through said, in the past, we only had to worry about security within a managed data center. However, today our environment is quite mixed. What are your thoughts on that?
So I believe Linus would have some thoughts on that as well, and Chris as well. But I alluded to very briefly when I was presenting. I think Linus did as well. The environments today are very mixed, very distributed. And I think it's not just the environment, it's also the type of applications that we are building, where container-based applications, the lifespan can be very short. The container pods spin up, and then it spins down, and then comes up with a new IP address, for example. So the notion of security and security, perimeters is changing, and that was one of the things I was trying to convey around adopting zero trust practices, zero trust principles, and not trusting anything, and defining, instead of one security perimeter that in the past we used to do for a data center, meaning anything that is in the data center is safe. We can't do that because today it can be anywhere. So using zero trust controls at the application layer and defining all these multiple security perimeters, I think from a technology angle, that is one way to overcome the challenges that a lot of companies with a distributed mixed environment are facing.
Very good. Linus?
Maybe I'll just add a couple of things there. In a separate survey that we ran with developers as well, we asked generally which infrastructure platforms you're likely to land on, right? So containers first, serverless architecture second, virtual machines third, right? So now, of course, we are in that era of standardization, right, based on open source standards. One of the things that I think is very, very important, right, when you think about security in this space, right, like I said, is the risk of supply chain attack, right? Most enterprises now practice, right, again, using perhaps repositories to make sure that they have accounted for their software bill of materials, right? If you are, it doesn't matter that you do vulnerability scanning and you feel that you've ticked the boxes, because those are what you do for compliance. You've ticked the box, but who knows? A month later, right, there is a vulnerability, a 0-day vulnerability, particularly, right, surface in a particular piece of open source tech that you happen to be using, right? It took some companies a lot of time to arrive at a situation where they could actually identify that, okay, these are all applications that are using these components, right? What you want to do is shorten that time to detect and response, right? So that's, I think that's what I'd like to add to this discussion.
Chris, unless you wanted to add something, I'm happy to.
Yeah, I'm happy to share a slightly different perspective because I agree with all the research and I agree with your insights. It's top of mind for most. So the way we consider this is, the operating run environment is growing, right? The complexity is heightened. Right? We have SaaS, we have PaaS, we have multi-vendor, we have IaaS, right? So those traditional ways of managing perimeter security has forever changed. But you can take a pessimistic view on that, or you can take an optimistic view. Right? The optimistic view is the hyperscales, regardless of who that is, whether it's ISV or the global cloud providers, are probably better at running cyber than we traditionally were, right? But because of those threat actors or threat vectors being higher, we have to have a end-to-end strategic view. And that's everything from operational run to software supply chain. And to be open, we see a lot of customers are really struggling with this. Right? There's no shortage of tooling in the market. We see a proliferation of mixed tooling, so different. And I think going to one of your core products value props, and what we Microsoft are doing too, is people are looking to standardize and have consistency regardless of where they run. And I think it's just a combination of all the things I mentioned. So that's just a different perspective. Software supply chain is a very significant element, but it's also that operational run is getting a lot more complicated.
No, thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate it. Well, look, we do have a couple of other questions that came through, but I'd like to just swing to the audience now, and just if there's any questions here for the gentleman. If you do have one, just maybe put your hand up, and I might just hand them. Yeah, if you want to maybe run the mic over, that'd be great.
So we see the big companies, Meta and Uber, and that release open source products. And some of that is attracting developers to them. They go, oh, that's so cool, that stuff they released. I want to go work there. Do you see a benefit if other companies who are maybe not big software houses doing a similar thing to use that to attract developers?
So yes, very much so. So there's two sides to this. A lot of companies trying to do inner source, right? So what do we mean by inner source? Traditionally, in a large enterprise or even a small business, each team would have their own siloed code lines. So first part of becoming open source ready or public external ready is getting it right internally, right? And that's not easy for a lot of businesses that have always had closed or ring fence, right? Now, I'm not saying everyone in the company should have right access to all code lines. That's not what I'm advocating for today, but at least read, right? And when we start that, right, there's a lot of benefit to the business themselves, right? You're probably going to have duplicate capabilities that you may not have known about. So straight away, you're getting that return on investment just through something as basic as turning your internal repositories to a company-wide read-only, right? So that's a good start. The next step to that is your API-based documentation or your wikis, right? So with that strategy, that is a huge part of talent attraction and retention. And I think in ANZ, we've got the market leaders that are doing this extremely well, and then some. And I think FSI is top of mind for most because they're advocating most in market, right? There's no shortage of references in your favorite digital news. But there's a lot of others that are doing it. They're just not advertising it well. So I think the concept of inner sourcing and some of those themes, for people that are trying to attract that top-end engineering talent, you're seeing this start to pop out in the job adverts. But I really advocate for inner source first because that's where your company is going to get value. And when we think of an engineering mindset, that's really what people want to do, right? Contribute and encourage collaboration, right? So within company, that's a good start. The next step, and to your question there, external is harder, but it's not impossible. So I think, in ANZ, traditionally we were not great at this in any industry. But I think Lana's touched on this. There's a lot of themes emerging from, say, the medical space with some of the standardization of what's going on in the biotech community and front-running standards there, including IoT, telco. I'm probably going to muck up the acronym, but in the open banking space, those canonical data models, and energy is another one. So I think as industries are starting to mature around standardization of interconnectivity and API specification, that's going to drive more open source. And I think as part of that, the companies that have their inner source strategy right or have their engineering maturity right, just to recap on the software supply chain, if you get those foundations right internally, then as you're front running, whether that's open banking or whatever industry you're in, you're naturally going to see that will tip into an external facing open source strategy.
We have to reach a point where we stop looking outside for open source because I think that's the number one thing a lot of people do. Let's see what's out there in the open. and instead, use the reverse mentality as that, can we do something? And I have a very good example. This is an example from Singapore. So during COVID, the Singapore government has a lot of developers. They do a lot of in-house development, and then they open source a lot of their projects. One of the things that they built was this application to do contact tracing. The protocol is called Blue Trace, and the application is called Open Trace, Trace Together. And the Singapore government, they made it open source, and I believe a lot of other countries were using that because during that time, the number one thing was how do you limit people from moving from secure to non-secure zones. So contact tracing was very important. So that's one very good example of the government doing inner sourcing, using their own development teams to not just build something, but then make it readily available for everyone else across the globe to benefit. So I think that's definitely something, a direction that I personally see more and more companies doing in the near future.
So I think we've probably got time for one more question from the audience, and then I might just get some sort of final thoughts from each of you as well. Was there another question someone wanted to? Yep, over there.
Thanks for the panel. Really interesting insights. I wanted to know. So I was earlier sending a message about ChatGPT, and I wonder with all the development and also the speed at which new insights are being gained, how far away are we from just saying deploy your infrastructure, make it super fast and secure, and it will just do it automatically?
Yeah, I might start this one, but keen to get the other panels. Look, I'm pretty realistic and pragmatic about this question. It's coming up a lot, so great question. My view is it will never replace developer, right? And I strongly believe that. I think it's an efficiency game, right? So when we look at a lot of what we do as developers and engineers and equivalent roles, it's not always top of mind how do I connect to a MySQL database or Postgres, right? We've all done it, but we forget about it. So what do we do when we forget? We go and do a Bing or Google search and chuck it in the IDE, make sure it compiles and go. And really, if we take that concept, that's what OpenAI and ChatGPT, and regardless of the use case, be that code or equivalent, that's really what it's doing. It's just making us more efficient, and those lower value activities will start to displace. But the concept of creativity, i.e., I've got a Figma design and I need to convert it into a code line, it can do that, right? And it will get smarter and smarter. But for those that have been in the technology space as long as me and probably longer than me, this is not a new concept, right? We've always had reverse engineering tooling that can translate from one language to another language, but you don't run that in production, right? And it helps you do that migration and it helps you do the refactoring, but you don't run it in production because it's not efficient. But I think this is where your question gets really, really interesting. If we start to having overlapping AI and we get efficiency gains in all of those value chains from creation of code or the concept of code to operational run, AI ops will probably mature. I don't think in my opinion, I don't think we'll ever get to a stage in our lifetime anyway where it will completely displace what we do. But I am pretty realistic. It's going to get very, very good at helping us with root cause analysis, response time to incident, helping us be more efficient with completing code, but it won't displace 40 to 60% of what we already do.
I'll just add a little bit to that because I have a different view as well. Look, we're going to go into ChatGPT, the GPT-4 basically, right? Which is going to give us like an exponential increase of what's available in 3.5 now, right? Hundreds of thousands or billions of parameters. There are 60 startups now around that OpenAI foundation, right? And a lot of them in the infrastructure and platform automation space. But actually the majority of them in the code dev space. So if you take GitHub Copilot, I think they publish it as roughly about 30 to 40% of code being developed by OpenAI right now. And when you think about all of the automation that's going to happen in the infrastructure and platform space, I think it allows the developer, like I said, to be a little bit more productive and focus on the innovation elements, right? Because if you put a pie chart onto what a developer spends a lot of their time on, and if you ask the developer what they would like to spend less of their time on and more of their time on, the answers usually gravitate towards the innovation, the business value, right, of the code, and less on the, all the architectural elements to, make sure that it happens. The reverse is also true. It's being used right now because it reads, language models very effectively. It's being used now to reverse engineer as well, like what Chris said. So you can actually look at a code base written by a developer who has since left the organization, and it can reverse and tell you, okay, this is essentially, it'll do a summary. It'll tell you essentially this is what the code does. It's like reading a big story and saying, TLDR, this is how the story ends. Okay, so it's very effective at that as well.
Thanks, Linus. So I just want to get some closing thoughts, I suppose, before we wrap up and head to lunch. So I think the question I've got for each of you is maybe just to share with the audience here, what is one trend you're seeing, whether it be in the area of security or otherwise? What are you kind of seeing in terms of trends and the future as well?
I mean, there are a lot of trends that I am seeing, but I'm going to be talking about something that is very relevant to SUSE and some of the things that we do, and something that is very relevant to a lot of organizations today. One of the biggest challenge, top of mind priorities today for many companies, it's because of we have seen a great adoption of public clouds, right? Is around data sovereignty, right? That comes up a lot. Who is responsible for my data, right? Who has access to my data? And from a technology angle, one of the trends that I see, and something which SUSE has been doing for a few years already from a research angle, is this whole technology space called confidential computing. Which if I give an analogy, is say if you are in the hotel and you put your passport in your safe, only you can open it because you have the keys to it. So it's similar to that, operating in the public cloud provider, but then keeping your data in a sandbox, in a closed environment, and nobody can see it because everything is encrypted, and only you have the keys to that. So there's a lot of advances that we have seen in the area of confidential computing. I understand a lot of the cloud providers are there as well, but I think that is something that I think in the next couple of years will gain a lot of traction here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks for sharing. Chris?
Probably two quick themes. I look at where the market is and where we're trending. I think the demand for developers is just going to continue to outpace supply. And we spent a lot of time thinking about that. And we could spend hours probably sharing perspectives on the why, but that's the reality. And in ANZ in particular, especially when we had the border closures, we're probably more challenged than most. And you're all seeing it, right? We're reinvesting in early stage graduate programs and doing things earlier with micro-credentials. And I think as an industry, we're just going to continue to grow. But on the technology side, and it goes to our chat earlier on, GitHub Copilot, yes, we have mixed views around no code, but I think no code will be increasingly important, especially to protect internal R&D to focus on those higher value, and where we're strangling business innovation, that we're giving them access to tooling and capability that can build out. So I see it as a huge focus. And then probably the other quick market trend, and not to talk too much about security, but I think it's just a reality that we're going to go through a consolidation and a rationalization. And I don't mean to lead on cost. I think that's just a consequence of a lot of top line thinking. But it's actually coming about because of the themes that we've all spoken about, right? The operational complexity and the threat metrics is growing. And it's growing because we have tooling proliferation and environment proliferation. And we have multiple ways of managing that. So if we take a quick stock take and an inventory, and probably IDC is seeing this in your research too, I think especially for customers that are running in multiple hosting environments, rather than having those point-to-point solutions, that we're going to see a lot more ISV adoption. And I think we're just at the start of that as an industry. So that's my quick perspective.
I'll just round it up on one of the charts that I showed, which is the digital business fabric. And like I said, most businesses today are pretty sophisticated in who they want to be, in the market, in their industries. They have a clearer articulation now on what digital capabilities they need to build. And you can be sure that it'll be unique to their business. You can be sure that there'll be need for devs and those capabilities as well to drive the innovation piece. I am concerned about skills here particularly, and then how we're going to ensure supply of that, because I know there's various methods. You talk about low code, no code, you talk about, there's offshoring, outsourcing, et cetera, but then that sort of like layers in, not just data sovereignty actually, digital sovereignty, right? What happens when, in the worst case scenario, right, your access, right, to third-party code, right, in one way or form presents a risk, sovereign risk as well, right? And that, I think, is the path that we're going to be headed down. Thanks.
Thanks, gentlemen. I think, one common theme there, I think, around, the developer skill set and availability, and I think, we're seeing that as well, and it's going to be a continued challenge, I think. Gentlemen, thanks so much for sharing your insights with everyone here. I'll let you get back to your seats.
Thank you.
So, look, if you do want to chat to one of us, we'll be hanging around for lunch. I hope you got a ton of value out of the last couple of hours. We appreciate you making the time in your day to join us here. All right?